Sometimes it takes just one careless word to reveal the truth about a man's soul. This is the story of a powerful CEO who thought he could humiliate a black janitor in front of everyone, reduce him to nothing more than useless, but what he didn't know was that the world doesn't stay silent forever. History has a way of answering back, and dignity has a way of shining through the cracks of cruelty. By the end of this story, you'll see how arrogance can collapse in a single day, and how God's justice often arrives when no one expects it. And you'll understand why everyone in that building, from interns to executives, still talks about the moment that changed everything. "Hey, you missed a spot, you useless old man." The voice cut through the polished glass lobby like a whip. Phones froze mid-scroll. A few young associates glanced up from their desks, their fingers stiff above their keyboards. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly felt louder, filling the heavy silence that followed. It was Richard Kessler, the CEO, tall, silver-haired, always wrapped in a $1,000 suit and the fake warmth of a practiced smile. In public, he was a philanthropist, all speeches, charity dinners, and glossy magazine covers. But behind closed doors inside the building, he ruled like a kingdom. The mask slipped often, and today it slipped hard. The man he was barking at was James Walker. 62 years old, skin dark as polished mahogany, shoulders slightly bent from years of labor, but eyes steady, deep and dignified. James had been working in that office building for more than a decade. He wasn't just a janitor. He was part of its rhythm, the silent keeper of its mornings and nights. James had been cleaning a corner near the reception desk when the insult hit him like a slap. He didn't flinch, didn't snap back. He simply straightened, rested his hand on the mop handle, and looked at Richard with quiet, almost ancient patience. Around them, whispers started. Someone at the far desk mouthed, "Did he just say that?" Another reached for their phone, tilting the screen like maybe, just maybe, it was worth recording. "Mr. Kessler," James said calmly, his voice carrying a weight that made a few spines stiffen. "Respect doesn't cost you a thing." The room held its breath. Richard smirked, dismissive. "Respect? You earn that, janitor. You clean up after the real work is done. Don't confuse yourself with the people who matter." James's eyes softened, not with weakness but with something sharper, almost like pity. He didn't answer. He went back to his work in silence, while Richard strutted toward the elevators, basking in the power of humiliation. But something had shifted. The air was different now. Everyone in that lobby, interns, secretaries, even the security guard by the door, felt it. They had just witnessed more than a cruel comment. They had seen the truth of the man who signed their paychecks. And though Richard thought it ended there, the story was only beginning. That night, James walked home through the cool autumn streets, his mop bucket wheels still echoing faintly in his memory. He lived in a modest neighborhood, a row of weathered houses where porches sagged but laughter still rose into the evening air. Inside his small living room, framed photos lined the walls. His late wife in her church choir robe, his daughter Maya holding her college diploma, his grandson's gap-toothed smile. James lowered himself into his armchair, his body heavy but his spirit unshaken. He had heard insults before. Born in the South in the early 1960s, he'd grown up with slurs spray-painted on school walls, with teachers who called him boy instead of his name, with doors closed simply because of the color of his skin. But this one felt different, not sharper, not crueler, just sadder, because it came from a man who had every privilege in the world and still chose cruelty as his language. Maya called later that evening. "Daddy, you sound tired." "Everything okay at work?" James hesitated. He didn't want to burden her. She had her own life, her own family. But she knew him too well. He said something, James admitted. Something ugly. "But don't worry, baby girl. I've been called worse." Maya's silence was long, then steady. "Daddy, you've carried too much on your back for too long. Maybe it's time someone else carried this fight." James chuckled softly. "The world don't change overnight, Maya. Sometimes all you can do is keep walking with dignity." What James didn't know was that someone had recorded the moment, and by the next morning the video would be everywhere. By sunrise, the city was already buzzing, not with traffic but with whispers carried through glowing screens. The video was only 14 seconds long, grainy from a phone camera, but it caught everything that mattered. Richard Kessler's voice was sharp, unmistakable. "Hey, you missed a spot, you useless old man." The frame shook slightly as the person recording turned. catching James's steady reply. Respect doesn't cost you a thing. Then silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. By 9 a.m., the clip had exploded across social media. Hashtags sprouted like wildfire. Respect costs nothing. Stand with James. Useless CEO. Some viewers watched it with disbelief. Could a man so celebrated for his philanthropy really speak that way? Others weren't surprised at all. That's how they talk when the cameras are off. One comment read. Inside the office building, the atmosphere was electric. Associates whispered in hallways. The receptionist, who had been just feet away from the scene, kept replaying it in her mind. James's calm dignity, Richard's venomous tone. Even the security guard, a former Marine who had seen plenty of arrogance in his day, muttered under his breath, "That old man's tougher than the whole damn boardroom." Richard himself hadn't seen it yet. He arrived late, sunglasses shielding his eyes, striding through the lobby like always. But instead of the usual chorus of, "Good morning, Mr. Kessler," he was met with silence. Heads turned away. A few phones pointed discreetly, capturing the walk of a man who didn't yet realize the storm waiting upstairs. At 10:15, his assistant, pale and jittery, stepped into his office. "Sir, we have a problem." Richard spun in his chair. "Problem? What kind of problem?" She swallowed hard, slid her phone across the desk and pressed play. The sound of his own voice, sharp, cruel, undeniable, filled the room. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time in years. Meanwhile, James was pushing his cart down a quiet hallway, unaware of the chaos unraveling online. He hummed an old gospel tune under his breath, one his mother used to sing in church. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." The tune wasn't just habit, it was armor. He had learned long ago that dignity was a kind of light, and if you kept it shining, no insult could truly dim it. But then his phone buzzed. A message from Maya. "Daddy, have you seen this?" She sent the link. James tapped it, and suddenly he was staring at himself on screen, mop in hand, standing against the cruelty of a CEO. His words, "Respect doesn't cost you a thing," now echoed across millions of phones. He sat on the edge of his bucket, stunned. He hadn't meant to make a statement. He hadn't planned to become a voice for anything. He was just living the way his parents raised him, with patience, with strength, with God in his heart. But now strangers were writing messages. "This man is my hero. We need more Jameses in the world. Give this man the CEO's salary. He's got more class in one sentence than Richard ever will." James closed his eyes, overwhelmed. Memories surged. His father being turned away from a bank because of the color of his skin. His mother scrubbing floors so her children could go to school. The marches he'd joined as a teenager where dogs barked and hoses blasted, but people kept walking anyway. History wasn't just history. It was alive, echoing. And somehow in this moment, James had become part of that echo. Back upstairs, Richard slammed his desk with a fist. "They're twisting it." It was a joke. Just a joke. But no one laughed. Not the assistant. Not the staff outside the glass walls of his office. Not the millions online and the board of directors. They had already called an emergency meeting. The boardroom on the 42nd floor had seen its share of storms. Hostile takeovers, billion-dollar negotiations, even FBI visits whispered about years ago. But nothing had rattled its walls quite like this. By noon, every director sat stiffly around the polished mahogany table. Some scrolled through their phones, watching the video play again and again, shaking their heads. Others whispered numbers, stock prices dipping, sponsorships pulling back, angry calls from investors. The chairman, a gray-eyed man named Lawrence Whitman, cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're not here to debate what we all heard." The CEO of this company called a 62-year-old black employee useless, on camera. And the man's dignified response is now a viral sensation. "Our phones haven't stopped ringing." A younger board member leaned forward, fire in her eyes. "This isn't just bad optics. This is a moral failure. We built our brand on community values. Every ad campaign, every public speech, it's all about respect and opportunity. If we defend him, we're done." Another director sighed. "Richard's been the face of this company for years. Investors trust him. He's brought in billions. Billions don't wash away hate, the young woman shot back. Not anymore. Not in this climate. The room buzzed. Arguments rose, fell. Some clung to profits, others to principle. But the truth was simple. The tide had already turned. And Richard? He wasn't invited to this meeting. Instead, he sat alone in his office, pacing like a caged animal, barking into his phone. They're exaggerating. This will blow over. Just wait a week. I'll release a statement. No, not an apology, just clarification. But outside his door, staff exchanged glances. For the first time, their fear of him was melting into something else. Contempt. Because when the mask cracks, it's hard to unsee the face behind it. By evening, the building's marble steps were no longer empty. Dozens of people had gathered, holding homemade signs. Respect costs nothing. We stand with James. Dignity dollars. Some were employees, slipping out after work with nervous courage. Others were strangers who'd seen the video and felt compelled to show up. A local news crew parked their van across the street. Cameras trained on the swelling crowd. James didn't know about it at first. He had taken the bus home, weary from a day heavier than most. But when Maya called, her voice was shaking with excitement. "Daddy, people are marching outside your job." "They're chanting your name." "My name?" James whispered, stunned. Maya sent him a clip. There it was, a crowd of voices rising together, calling, "James! James, James!" Not because he was rich, not because he was famous, but because he had stood with quiet dignity when cruelty tried to break him. Tears stung his eyes. He thought of his parents, long gone, who had carried water buckets in fields and prayed for a day when their children might walk with heads held high. He thought of his grandson, who might one day ask, "Grandpa, what did you do when the world tried to shame you?" And he would have an answer. Back at the office, Richard peered through the blinds, his jaw tight. The chants echoed up the glass towers, a sound he couldn't silence. For the first time, he felt something he rarely knew. Fear. The board's decision would come in the morning. But the streets had already spoken. James hadn't planned to speak publicly. He was a quiet man, content to let others take the spotlight. But the world had other plans. The local news knocked on his door the next morning. Meyer insisted he at least open it. "Mr. Walker," the reporter said gently, microphone lowered. "People across the country are calling you a symbol of dignity. What do you want to say to them?" James shifted uncomfortably, his work clothes still neatly pressed. "I'm no symbol," he said slowly. "I'm just a man trying to do his job with respect. My mama always told me, dignity isn't something the world gives you. It's something you carry inside. And when someone tries to take it, you hold tighter." The reporter blinked, stunned by the raw honesty. The clip aired that night, and within hours it spread nationwide. Ministers quoted it in sermons. Teachers shared it in classrooms. Ordinary people whispered, "He's right. That's how my grandfather used to talk." Meanwhile, Richard's PR team scrambled. He finally issued a statement. 3 stiff sentences crafted by lawyers. "I regret the misunderstanding. My words were taken out of context. I remain committed to diversity and inclusion." But no one believed him, because authenticity can't be faked. And James had it in every breath. That evening, James sat on his porch, the news glowing faintly through the window. He rocked slowly in his chair, the wood creaking like an old hymn. His mind drifted back unbidden to Montgomery, Alabama, 1968. He had been just 5 years old when his father was turned away from a gas station restroom. He remembered the look on his father's face, humiliation wrapped in silence. His father never raised his voice. He just held James's small hand tighter and walked away. "Someday," his father had said quietly, "the world will know respect is the only real currency." Now, 54 years later, those words echoed in his heart. It wasn't lost on James that history had a cruel rhythm, different decade, different setting. But the sting of being called useless because of skin color carried the same poison. But maybe, just maybe, this time the world was ready to answer differently. He whispered into the night air as if speaking to his father. "You were right. Respect is the only thing that lasts." Maya, sitting beside him, took his hand. "Daddy, people are listening." Really listening? And for the first time in years, James believed it. Chapter 9. The Fall of a Titan. At 9 a.m. sharp, the board reconvened. The directors' faces were stone as Richard entered, his confidence a thin mask. Let's not overreact, he began, adjusting his cufflinks. This will pass. People forget. They always do. No, Lawrence Whitman, the chairman, interrupted firmly. Not this time. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were numbers. Plummeting stock prices, canceled contracts, shareholder fury. But more damning than numbers were the words written in bold ink. The reputation of this company cannot survive with Richard Kessler as CEO. Richard's jaw tightened. You're firing me? Over a janitor? A silence heavier than lead filled the room. Then the young board member spoke. No, over your own words. Over your arrogance. Over the truth you revealed when you thought no one was watching. Richard's face turned crimson. He slammed his fist down, rattling water glasses. You'll regret this. But as he stormed out, something happened that he hadn't expected. Employees lining the hallway didn't shrink back in fear like they used to. They didn't bow their heads. They didn't rush to look busy. They just watched him leave. Silent. Cold. United. And in that silence, Richard realized the truth. His reign of intimidation was over. By noon, news outlets were reporting it. CEO fired after racist comment to janitor. The empire had fallen in less than 24 hours. The next morning, when James arrived at work, the lobby was different. Not polished silence, not whispered gossip, but applause. Secretaries, security guards, interns, even executives who had once passed him without a glance now stood waiting. As soon as James stepped through the glass doors, the room erupted. Hands clapping, voices cheering. Some even had tears in their eyes. James froze, his mop bucket squeaking softly behind him. What's all this for? The receptionist stepped forward, her voice shaking. For you, Mr. Walker. For the way you showed us what real respect looks like. Someone handed him a bouquet of sunflowers. Another slipped him a handwritten note. You made me believe my work matters. James's throat tightened. He wasn't used to being the center of anything. He had lived a life of service, content to stay in the background. But now the background had pushed him forward. And though part of him wanted to retreat, another part, the part that remembered his father's words, his mother's hymns, told him to stand tall. So he nodded, eyes glistening, and said softly, Thank you. But remember, it's not about me. It's about the way we treat each other, always. The applause grew louder. Later that week, James was called into a meeting, not with the board, but with the new interim CEO, a woman named Claire Donovan. Unlike Richard, she didn't wear arrogance on her sleeve. She greeted James with a warm smile and asked him to sit, not as an employee, but as an equal. James, she began, I want to thank you. You reminded this company, and the world, what dignity looks like. We want to do more than just apologize. We want to make things right. James shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, I don't need no headlines. I just want to do my job. Claire leaned forward. And you will if you choose. But I also want to offer you something more. We're creating a new position. Director of Employee Dignity and Culture. Someone to make sure voices like yours are always heard. Someone to remind us that respect isn't a slogan. It's a practice. I'd like you to take it. James blinked, stunned. He had cleaned floors his whole life. Now they wanted him to guide the culture of an entire corporation. He thought of his daughter, his grandson, the generations before him who never got the chance to step into such rooms. Slowly he nodded. If it helps people be treated right, I'll do it, Claire smiled. Then welcome to leadership, Mr. Walker. Word spread quickly. The same people who had once overlooked James now lined up to shake his hand. Local churches invited him to speak. Civil rights groups praised his example. Even high school students began sharing his words in classrooms. Respect doesn't cost you a thing. On Sunday, his church held a celebration. The choir sang louder than usual, and the pastor called James to the front. Brother Walker, the pastor said, voice deep and reverent. Sometimes God chooses the humblest among us to deliver the loudest message. You stood in silence against hate, and that silence thundered louder than any sermon. Today, we honor you. The congregation rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, Amen, and Hallelujah. James stood there overwhelmed, clutching his Bible. He thought of Richard sitting somewhere alone with his pride and bitterness. And for a brief moment, he felt no anger, no triumph, only pity. Because true victory wasn't about destroying someone else. It was about proving that dignity always outlasts arrogance. As the choir sang, James whispered a prayer of gratitude. Not for fame, not for recognition, but for the reminder that even in a broken world, God's will still moved like a river, carving justice out of stone. What happened inside that office didn't stay inside those walls. Other companies began calling meetings, asking themselves uncomfortable questions. How do we treat the invisible workers? Do we value them or just use them? Across the country, janitors, cleaners, cafeteria staff, and security guards started sharing their own stories online. Many wrote, "I am James Walker." Some companies promised reforms. Others ignored the conversation, but the seed had been planted. A movement had begun, not led by celebrities or politicians, but by a man who once pushed a mop down silent hallways. James didn't see himself as a leader. He still rode the bus to work, still packed his lunch in a paper bag, still greeted everyone with a nod and a smile. But everywhere he went, people stopped him. Grocery stores, barber shops, even the sidewalk outside his church. You gave me hope. You reminded me to stand tall. You showed me that respect is power. It wasn't the kind of fame James wanted, but it was the kind of legacy he accepted. Weeks later, Richard Kessler returned to the building. Not as CEO, but as a man desperate to collect the last of his belongings. His expensive suit couldn't hide the slump in his shoulders. The same employees who once feared him now walked past without a glance. He caught sight of James near the lobby. For a moment, time froze. Richard sneered, but his voice lacked its old sharpness. "Hope you're enjoying the spotlight." James didn't rise to the bait. He simply looked at him, eyes calm, voice steady. "I don't need a spotlight, Richard. I just needed respect. And maybe one day you'll understand that." Richard muttered something under his breath and hurried out, clutching a box of his trophies and awards. But none of them mattered anymore. He had lost the one thing James had never surrendered: dignity. Months later, James stood in front of a crowd of young interns during orientation week. His new title, Director of Employee Dignity and Culture, meant he got to speak directly to them. He cleared his throat, gripping the podium with steady hands. "I'm not here to give you a corporate lecture," he began. "I'm here to remind you of something simple. Titles fade. Money comes and goes. But the way you treat the person beside you, that lasts. Respect doesn't cost you a thing, but it can change everything." The room was silent, every young face locked on him. And James realized this was the true victory. Not a CEO falling, not applause in a lobby, not headlines. But planting seeds in the next generation, so they would never mistake arrogance for strength. That night, sitting on his porch with Maya and his grandson, James watched the sun dip low, painting the sky gold. The boy asked softly, "Grandpa, is it true you beat the mean boss?" James chuckled. "No, son. I didn't beat him. I just showed the world what matters more than power." The boy tilted his head. "What's that?" James smiled, eyes glistening. "Dignity." And as the evening crickets sang, James whispered a prayer of gratitude. For the pain, for the journey, for the proof that even in a world full of arrogance and cruelty, God's will could still bend the story toward justice. Respect isn't a favor. It isn't a luxury. It is the bare minimum of human decency. Richard thought he could strip a man of dignity with one cruel word. Instead, he stripped himself of everything he once held. James's story reminds us all. True power doesn't come from titles or wealth. It comes from the quiet strength of standing tall when the world tries to bend you. What would you have done in James's place?